Some ideas are dangerous not because they are false, but because too many structures depend on people never examining whether they are true. A belief can sustain a civilization for centuries. It can organize laws, sanctify rulers, comfort the grieving, define morality, and tell millions of people who they are. But what happens when someone asks a question that reaches beneath the belief itself? What happens when reason begins examining the foundation, rather than merely decorating the walls built upon it? This is where our story begins, with a truth said to have been buried beneath generations of doctrine, fear, authority, and silence. Amsterdam, 1677. In a modest room, far removed from the religious community that had expelled him, and equally distant from the churches that regarded his philosophy with suspicion, Baruch Spinoza was approaching the end of his life. He was only 44. To much of Europe, he was already dangerous. To some, he was an atheist. To others, a heretic. To a smaller number of careful readers, however, Spinoza represented something far more unsettling. A thinker willing to follow reason, even when reason threatened conclusions that society considered untouchable. Yet to understand what brought him to that final room, we must return several years earlier. March 1670. Rain pressed against the windows of a small Amsterdam study, while Spinoza sat surrounded by manuscripts. During the day, he earned his modest living through the painstaking work of polishing lenses. At night, another kind of lens occupied him, the lens of reason, through which he attempted to examine reality without relying upon inherited assumptions. Before him lay a text unlike the philosophical books he normally studied. According to the accounts surrounding it, the manuscript had reached Amsterdam through secret channels. It contained a Latin rendering of far older fragments associated with ancient Near Eastern traditions, material supposedly excluded from the scriptural canon, familiar to Jews and Christians. Whether dangerous because of what it actually proved or because of what it suggested, the effect on Spinoza was the same. He read slowly, then he stopped. Then he returned to the passage again. The text described humanity's beginning, but not as an instantaneous act in which a fully formed first man suddenly appeared through direct supernatural craftsmanship. Instead, humanity was depicted as becoming, gradually, through nature, through processes extending across immense periods of time. The implications immediately disturbed him, not emotionally in the ordinary sense, but intellectually. His mind began following the chain of consequences. If humanity had developed through nature, rather than appearing complete in a single moment, what became of the traditional interpretation of Adam? What became of the fall? What became of inherited guilt? What became of the theological system built upon the assumption that humanity began perfect, fell from that original state, and therefore required restoration to something once possessed? One altered premise could transform an entire structure. This is the difficulty with foundational beliefs. Their importance does not come merely from the statement itself. Their importance comes from everything that depends upon them. Spinoza rose from the table and approached the window. Amsterdam slept beneath the rain. It was celebrated as one of Europe's comparatively tolerant cities. But Spinoza understood that tolerance had boundaries. A society may permit disagreement while still punishing anyone who questions the assumptions upon which religious and political authority depend. He knew this personally. In 1656, while still a young man, he had been expelled from Amsterdam's Jewish community under an exceptionally severe ban. Whatever combination of ideas, associations, and developing convictions led to that rupture, the result was unmistakable. Spinoza learned early that intellectual independence could have social consequences. He had lost community. He had lost security. He had become a man, standing outside the boundaries that normally tell people where they belong. And yet exile had given him something difficult to obtain from within any protected system: distance. From a distance, assumptions become visible. From a distance, what once appeared inevitable begins to look historical. From a distance, the mind can ask a dangerous question. What if something is believed not because reason demonstrates it, but because generations have repeated it? Spinoza returned to his desk. Another connection now became unavoidable. If humanity emerged through natural processes, then humanity could not be placed outside nature. And if human beings were within nature, governed by the same necessary order as everything else, then the traditional separation between humanity, creation, and God became increasingly difficult to maintain within the philosophical framework Spinoza was developing. For Spinoza, God could not ultimately be conceived as an enlarged human personality existing somewhere beyond the universe, thinking, choosing, becoming angry, changing intentions, distributing favors, and interrupting natural order whenever circumstances demanded it. The deeper possibility was far more radical. God and nature were not two independent realities. Deus, Sive, Natura. God, or nature. Not because nature replaced God with something smaller, but because the divine could no longer be imprisoned inside the image of a supernatural monarch standing apart from existence. There was one infinite reality. Everything finite existed within it. A tree, a planet, an animal, a human body, a human thought. You, me. None would be independent substances existing by themselves. Each would be a particular expression of the same underlying reality, and this changed the meaning of human importance. Humanity could still be extraordinary without being metaphysically separate. A wave is real, but it is not independent of the ocean. Its form appears, it rises, it travels, it disappears. Yet throughout its entire existence, nothing composing the wave was ever separate from the water. Perhaps, Spinoza began to wonder, the traditional statement that humanity exists in the image of God had been misunderstood. Maybe the resemblance was never supposed to mean that somewhere beyond the clouds existed a cosmic person possessing human-like intelligence and will. Perhaps the relationship was ontological rather than physical. A finite being could express infinite reality without being identical to the whole of it. That possibility was more subtle than ordinary religion and far more dangerous. Because if God was not separated from nature, the relation between mind and body also required reconsideration. The mysterious text before him reportedly pushed the question even further. Consciousness, it suggested, was not something inserted into lifeless matter from outside, as though a divine craftsman had completed a body and then added a soul. Mind and body belonged together. For Spinoza, this resonated powerfully with a conviction he had already been developing. Thought and extension should not be treated as two completely independent substances, mysteriously interacting across an impossible metaphysical gap. They could instead be understood as different attributes through which one reality is expressed. The consequence is easy to state, but difficult to absorb. You are not a ghost temporarily imprisoned inside a machine. Your body is not merely the container of the real you. Mind and body belong to one order. And if this is true, then the old boundary between sacred and material existence begins to dissolve. Nature is no longer spiritually empty. Matter is no longer the opposite of the divine. Humanity is no longer a foreign visitor placed into the universe. We belong to the universe because we arise within the same reality from which everything else follows. Spinoza took up his pen. Tradition, he reasoned, deserves examination precisely when it demands exemption from examination. Age does not make a proposition true. Authority does not make a contradiction disappear. And repetition cannot substitute for demonstration. He considered the creation narratives themselves. Different passages seemed to arrange creation differently. Traditions had clearly been transmitted, interpreted, organized, and expressed through human language. Why then should every theological detail be treated as though it were a literal description of natural history? Look instead at nature, Spinoza's reasoning suggested. Seeds develop into plants. Living beings arise from other living beings. Events emerge through causes. Effects follow conditions. Nature operates through continuity and necessity. Why should humanity alone require us to abandon the very order observable everywhere else? But here the argument became even more unsettling. If humanity belonged completely to nature, then human choice also belonged to nature. And if every thought, desire, decision, fear, and action arose within a chain of causes, what remained of the absolute free will people imagined themselves possessing? Perhaps human beings called themselves free for the same reason. A stone, if conscious while falling, might imagine that it had chosen its trajectory. They were aware of their actions, but ignorant of the causes producing them. This did not necessarily eliminate freedom. It transformed its meaning. Freedom could no longer mean existing without causes. Nothing exists without causes. Instead, freedom might mean understanding the causes that move us, so that we become less enslaved by impulses we mistake for sovereign decisions. That possibility would eventually become one of the most powerful elements of Spinoza's philosophy. But on that rainy night, the implications were still unfolding. He was confronting a vision of humanity in which man was neither the ruler of nature nor a fallen stranger within it. Man was nature becoming conscious in one particular form, finite, conditioned, necessary, and yet capable of understanding the order to which he belonged. By dawn, the candles had nearly disappeared into pools of wax. Spinoza looked over the pages he had written. He understood the danger. Europe had already shown what could happen when philosophical speculation collided with theological authority. He did not need martyrdom to prove that an idea was valuable, so he gathered the pages, folded them carefully, and concealed them. The world outside was beginning another ordinary morning. Ovens were being lit. Merchants prepared their shops. Bells called believers to prayer. People stepped into streets believing that reality was essentially what they had always been told it was. But inside one small room, a more disturbing question had already been born. What if humanity had never been separate from nature? And what if the deepest mistake was not simply misunderstanding the origin of man, but misunderstanding the origin of our idea of God itself? Spinoza did not yet know that this second question would soon become impossible to avoid. Because the manuscript before him was only the beginning, the question did not leave him. For months after that rainy night, Spinoza tried to return to ordinary life. He polished lenses, he read, he corresponded with thinkers, he walked through Amsterdam as he had before. Yet the world no longer appeared the same. Once an assumption collapses, everything built upon it becomes visible in a different light. Creation, human nature, sin, freedom, God, authority. Spinoza had not received final answers. What he possessed was something more intellectually dangerous, a new set of questions. Then, in June of 1670, according to the narrative preserved in the account, a letter arrived. There was no recognizable seal identifying an institution or noble household. The envelope was delivered discreetly by a messenger, unwilling to explain its origin. The name at the bottom connected it to Adriaan Courbag, the Dutch physician and radical freethinker whose criticisms of conventional theology had already brought devastating consequences. The letter claimed something extraordinary. The document Spinoza had examined was incomplete. There were additional fragments, and those fragments, the writer suggested, did not merely concern humanity's physical beginnings. They concerned the historical development of the human idea of God. That distinction mattered enormously, because asking whether God exists is one question. Asking how human beings came to imagine God in a particular way is another. The second question can be investigated historically. Why do people imagine divine authority as a king? Why is God represented as commanding, rewarding, punishing, becoming angry, demanding loyalty, choosing peoples, establishing laws, and defeating enemies? How much of this language describes ultimate reality? And how much reflects the political structures familiar to the people creating religious language? The letter offered Spinoza a riddle. Look, it essentially told him, where maps become unreliable, where land becomes water, and water becomes land. For days he could not understand it. Then the geography of the Netherlands itself provided the clue. Much of Dutch civilization existed through an extraordinary struggle with water. Land had been reclaimed from the sea through dikes, drainage systems, canals, and polders. A place marked as water on an older map might later become cultivated ground. A region represented as stable earth could once again disappear beneath flooding. Here, literally, land became water, and water became land. Spinoza remembered an abandoned polder near Leiden, and curiosity defeated caution. He traveled without announcing his purpose. The account describes a gray morning, narrow canals, windmills turning under a low sky, and a reluctant boatman carrying the philosopher toward a half-flooded stretch of unstable land. Spinoza stepped into the mud alone. What exactly was he seeking? He could not know. Yet human beings have always been willing to cross extraordinary distances when they believe an answer lies just beyond what they already understand. He probed the ground. Again. For nearly an hour there was nothing. Mud entered his clothing. His hands became cold, his body tired. Reason told him that the entire journey might have been built upon a misunderstanding. Then the stick struck something solid. He knelt. He dug. Beneath the wet earth, his fingers encountered metal. The story says he uncovered a sealed box, approximately the size of a large book, protected against moisture with wax and resin. At that moment, the philosophical problem became physical. Ideas that had existed only as hypotheses now seemed to possess weight. He concealed the object beneath his coat and returned to the boat. The boatman asked whether he had found what he wanted. Spinoza gave him no explanation. Some truths, if they exist at all, begin their lives not through public proclamation but through silence. Back in Amsterdam, he locked the door. The metal container rested on the table before him. He examined it carefully. If what the letter had suggested was true, then the contents could challenge not only doctrines concerning humanity's origin, but something even deeper. The assumption that the concept of God held by later religious institutions had always existed in the same form. But before imagining the answer, we need to examine the question. Where did the idea of a God radically separate from nature come from? Many people assume that humanity has always thought this way. Yet religious history is far more complicated. Ancient cultures encountered divinity through storms, fertility, animals, mountains, rivers, stars, ancestors, kings, and forces of nature. The boundary between sacred and natural existence was often far less rigid than it became in later theological systems. This does not prove that one religious conception is true and another false, but it reveals something crucial. Human descriptions of ultimate reality have histories, and once we recognize that descriptions have histories, we must distinguish the thing being described from the language human beings use to describe it. Spinoza's philosophy would make this distinction brutally clear. People imagine God according to human psychology because human beings naturally interpret what they do not understand through what they already know. A king commands, so God commands. A judge condemns, so God condemns. A parent rewards obedience, so God rewards obedience. A ruler becomes angry at rebellion, so divine anger becomes imaginable. But does reality itself possess human emotions? Does the infinite think like a finite organism? Does nature become offended? Does the structure of existence suspend itself because a human being has violated a social prohibition? Spinoza regarded such anthropomorphism with deep suspicion. The infinite cannot simply be a human personality enlarged without limit. A child may imagine the wind is angry because the storm frightens him. An adult begins asking about pressure, temperature, and atmospheric movement. The storm does not become less magnificent when understood. It becomes more intelligible. Perhaps the same transition was necessary in theology. To replace imagination with understanding is not necessarily to destroy the sacred. It may be to free the sacred from projection. Spinoza broke the seal. The lid resisted. Metal had corroded. He forced it open. Inside, according to the story, lay several carefully protected scrolls. He unfolded the first. The language appeared ancient. The account identifies it with traditions surrounding the religious reforms of King Josiah of Judah in the 7th century BCE. And here the narrative becomes more provocative. The scroll did not describe a sacred book simply descending from heaven. It described editing, compilation, selection, political centralization. The text claimed that older traditions had been gathered and reorganized in order to unite a population beneath one religious structure, one God, one authorized sanctuary, one law, one national identity. Whether taken historically or symbolically within the narrative, the philosophical question is powerful. What happens when political unity and theological unity become the same project? Religion can comfort. Religion can inspire extraordinary compassion. Religion can produce art, community, sacrifice, and moral discipline. But religion can also become authority. And authority naturally prefers narratives that stabilize authority. Spinoza continued reading. The scroll described multiple ancient stories concerning human beginnings. According to the narrative, these traditions had been simplified into a more accessible account. One God, one first man, earth or clay, a single originating act. Complexity had become story. Process had become event. Nature had become command. Spinoza stopped. If this account were true, then perhaps mythology was not simply stupidity. Perhaps mythology was compression. Human beings reduce overwhelming complexity into narratives they can remember. A civilization does not teach metaphysics to every child through geometric demonstrations. It tells stories. The philosophical danger begins only when the story forgets that it is a story, when metaphor demands the status of mechanism, when poetry becomes geology, when symbolic anthropology becomes biological history, when narrative authority forbids investigation. Spinoza reached for the second scroll, and the argument became even more unsettling, because now the question was no longer merely, how did people imagine the first human being? It was, why did humanity separate God from the world at all? That question would lead him toward a conclusion much closer to the center of his philosophy than anything he had yet discovered. And once he saw it, the distinction between theology and politics would never again appear innocent. The second scroll, as the story tells it, contained the most politically explosive claim of all. The concept of a single divine ruler standing outside creation had not always existed in precisely the form later institutions would defend. Earlier religious imagination, according to the text, experienced the sacred within the world. Nature was not spiritually empty. Life itself carried divine significance. The distinction between creator and creation had not yet become an absolute metaphysical wall. Then political necessity entered. A distant god could speak through authorized representatives. A divine king could legitimize an earthly king. One heavenly lawgiver could support one earthly system of law. One exclusive truth could create one obedient people. Spinoza understood immediately why this mattered. Power does not merely command bodies. Its most durable form organizes imagination. If authority controls what people believe their origin to be, it influences what they believe themselves permitted to become. If authority defines God, it can also define obedience. This does not mean every priest is secretly manipulating believers. That would be far too simplistic. Institutions are more complicated. People can sincerely believe the very systems they reproduce. A tradition may arise from political necessity, psychological need, poetic imagination, genuine moral insight, and sincere spiritual experience simultaneously. Spinoza's task was therefore not merely to accuse, it was to understand causes. That distinction is essential. Hatred says, "They deceived us." Understanding asks, what combination of fear, social organization, historical pressure, and human imagination produced this belief? The second question is more difficult. It is also more Spinozist. The third scroll deepened the argument again. The anonymous writer, within the narrative, warned that institutional religion can become an instrument of power, while insisting that this does not prove the absence of the divine. That sentence changes everything. Criticizing a human concept of God is not identical to denying reality's ultimate depth. Rejecting superstition is not necessarily rejecting spirituality. Exposing religious construction does not force one into nihilism. This is precisely where Spinoza differs from the caricature of the atheist who simply removes God and leaves an empty universe behind. Spinoza does not empty reality. He fills all reality with necessity. God is no longer one being among other beings. God is not somewhere. God is the infinite reality within which every somewhere exists. A distant deity disappears, but existence itself becomes divine. For generations, critics would hear only the first half. They would hear that Spinoza rejected the personal ruler of traditional theology. They would conclude that he rejected God. But Spinoza's actual move was stranger. He rejected a limited God because the infinite could not be limited enough to resemble a human sovereign. He did not say nature exists without God. He argued that the separation itself was mistaken. Deus, Sive, Natura. God, or nature, not two things. One reality understood without the projections of human imagination. The scrolls, in the story, seemed to confirm what his reasoning had already been approaching. But confirmation created a practical crisis. What should he do? Publish them? Hide them? Destroy them? Spinoza knew enough of 17th century Europe to understand that ideas did not exist in a vacuum. A proposition could cost someone a career. A book could cost someone freedom. A theological challenge could cost someone life. Therefore, he chose another path. He would write philosophy, not accusation, not revelation, demonstration. The power of Spinoza's mature method lies precisely here. He did not want readers to accept his conclusions because a hidden manuscript said so. That would merely replace one authority with another. If a man abandons Scripture because an older scroll commands him to abandon Scripture, he has not become free. He has only changed masters. Freedom required understanding. So Spinoza would attempt something far more radical. He would begin with definitions and axioms. He would build propositions. He would demonstrate relationships. He would try to make his philosophy unfold with the necessity of geometry. Why? Because a geometric truth does not ask who your priest is. It does not ask your nationality. It does not care whether your ancestors approved. If the demonstration is sound, you confront it through reason. This method became the architecture of the ethics. One substance, infinite attributes, finite modes, mind and body understood not as independent worlds, but as expressions of one reality. human desire governed by causes, emotion governed by causes, freedom redefined through adequate understanding. Everything would be connected. The true challenge to theology was therefore not hidden in a sentence saying religion is false. It was embedded far deeper. If everything follows from the necessity of divine nature, then miracles understood as violations of nature become conceptually confused. Why would God violate God? If nature is the expression of divine necessity, then calling an event supernatural implies that reality has temporarily ceased following its own reality. Spinoza could not accept that. Similarly, divine punishment becomes difficult to understand in human terms. Fire burns because of what fire is. Gravity acts because of what physical relations are. Hatred produces consequences because of what hatred does to human beings and communities. We do not need to imagine nature becoming angry. Consequences follow causes, and here ethics itself changes. People often obey moral systems through fear. Do this because God rewards it. Avoid that because God punishes it. Spinoza seeks something more mature. Understand what increases your power to act rationally. Understand what produces hatred. Understand what envy does. Understand how resentment keeps you dependent upon the person you resent. Understand how uncontrolled desire can enslave the very person who believes he is freely choosing. Virtue then becomes less like obedience and more like intelligent participation in reality. But the philosopher's growing confidence would soon collide with something reason alone could not easily solve. Human beings may be capable of reason. They are not usually governed by reason. Europe would remind Spinoza of this with horrifying force. In 1672, the Dutch Republic entered one of the darkest crises in its history. Foreign armies threatened the country. Political panic intensified. Public anger searched for enemies. And crowds did what frightened crowds have done in many centuries. They transformed uncertainty into hatred. Johann de Witt and his brother Cornelis became targets. The violence against them shocked Spinoza profoundly. The source narrative dramatizes his reaction, but the philosophical importance is clear even without embellishment. Here was a thinker attempting to understand humanity through reason confronted by humanity, possessed by passion. What value is truth when fear controls the crowd? What happens when people do not experience an argument as an invitation to think, but as an attack upon the identity holding their world together? This was no longer an abstract problem. Spinoza had been asking whether human beings were free. Now he witnessed people behaving like storms, one body influencing another, one rumor causing another reaction, fear producing anger, anger producing violence, violence producing imitation, a chain of causes spreading through a population. The mob believed it acted freely. Spinoza could see necessity. This is the terrifying side of determinism. Understanding causes does not always make humanity look noble. Sometimes it reveals how easily a person can be moved by forces he does not recognize. Propaganda, fear, humiliation, group loyalty, religious enthusiasm, political resentment, the desire to belong, the pleasure of punishing a common enemy. People call these choices, but how many of them understand what is choosing through them? The massacre forced Spinoza to reconsider a hope he had carried quietly. Perhaps sufficient truth could free people from superstition. But what if truth presented at the wrong moment does not liberate? What if it destabilizes? What if a mind that loses one belief before gaining deeper understanding does not become rational, but desperate? The distinction between destroying illusion and cultivating wisdom now became essential. And it was precisely at this moment, according to the dramatic narrative of the source, that a mysterious visitor arrived at Spinoza's door. A man from Rome, a man claiming to belong to the church, a man who, instead of condemning Spinoza's philosophy, told him something far more disturbing. You may be right, but that does not mean humanity is ready to hear it. The visitor arrived at night. Rain fell again over Amsterdam, almost as if the story were returning Spinoza to the atmosphere in which the first revelation had begun. A tall figure stood beyond the door beneath a dark cloak. According to the narrative, he identified himself privately as a cardinal of the Roman Church, but insisted that his official identity mattered less than the group he represented. He belonged, he claimed, to a hidden circle entrusted with dangerous theological knowledge. Spinoza listened cautiously. The visitor examined pages from the philosopher's developing work. He encountered the idea that had already placed Spinoza beyond the boundaries of conventional doctrine. Deus, Sive, Natura, God, or nature. Instead of condemning it, The cardinal called it elegant, dangerous, and essentially correct. For a moment, the normal structure of conflict disappeared. The supposed defender of orthodoxy was not arguing that Spinoza was mistaken. He was arguing that truth itself could be socially dangerous. This is a much harder position to defeat. If someone says, "Your argument is false," you can present evidence. But what if he says, "Your argument may be true, and that is precisely why it must not be widely understood"? The cardinal's reasoning, as dramatized in the source, was political. Civilizations survive partly through shared narratives. After the fragmentation of the Roman world, Christianity had provided Europe with an enormous symbolic structure: one moral universe, one sacred history, one ultimate judge, one drama of creation, fall, redemption, and final justice. Was every element literally true? The visitor suggested that educated insiders had long known religious texts were more historically complicated than ordinary believers imagined. But literal accuracy, he argued, was not the only function of religion. Narratives create social order. They give suffering meaning. They restrain behavior. They connect strangers beneath shared symbols. Remove those symbols suddenly, he warned, and rationality may not replace them. Chaos may. Spinoza objected. So you preserve falsehood in order to control people? The cardinal reframed it. Not falsehood, adapted truth. A truth mediated through images people can psychologically bear. Spinoza hated the argument because part of him had already begun to understand it. Look at the murdered DeWitt brothers. The crowd had not become enlightened by uncertainty. It had become violent. But the cardinal's reasoning contained another danger. Once authorities grant themselves permission to decide which truths ordinary people are ready to know, paternalism can justify almost anything. Censorship becomes compassion. Manipulation becomes protection. Power becomes the guardian of maturity. Who decides when humanity is ready? The same institution benefiting from secrecy? Spinoza saw the trap. The cardinal then revealed why he had come. The church, within the story, knew of the scrolls. Courbag had been interrogated. Enough information had emerged for interested authorities to understand that historical documents might exist, which could lend material support to ideas Spinoza had reached philosophically. The visitor offered a bargain. Continue thinking. Continue writing. Complete the ethics. But do not reveal the scrolls. Allow philosophy to proceed indirectly. Let difficult truths reach people gradually rather than through an explosive historical claim capable of destabilizing religious authority. If Spinoza agreed, he would be left alone. If he refused, the visitor warned, both philosopher and documents might disappear. Spinoza asked the obvious question. If the documents survived, when would the world finally be ready? Perhaps in generations, perhaps centuries, perhaps never. The answer exposed the dilemma in its purest form. Truth versus prudence. Principle versus consequence. Is hiding truth always cowardice? Is revealing truth always courage? Suppose a doctor possesses information that will devastate a patient. Honesty matters, but so do timing, context, language, preparation, and purpose. Truth without understanding can become another weapon. Yet concealment can also become domination. There is no simple formula. The cardinal left Spinoza 3 days. The philosopher hardly slept. One side of his mind argued that truth possesses its own moral claim. If a doctrine is historically constructed, people deserve to know. No priest, philosopher, king, or institution should own reality. A human being cannot become intellectually free while forbidden from examining the origin of the beliefs governing his conscience. But another part of him saw human psychology. Take away a person's worldview, and you do not automatically give him reason. You may give him emptiness. Suppose a man endures poverty because he believes suffering participates in a larger purpose. Suppose a mother survives the death of her child because she believes she will see that child again. Suppose someone resists cruelty because he imagines every action judged by an eternal moral intelligence. If you destroy these beliefs in one afternoon, what replaces them? A geometric proof? A lecture on substance? The intellectual love of God? Spinoza believed reason could produce a profound form of peace, but he could not pretend every person was ready to live through reason alone. This is where the source introduces one of its central ideas. Different human beings may relate to truth through different levels of understanding. We should be careful with this idea. It can easily become arrogance. The philosopher must not imagine himself superior merely because his mythology is more abstract. Even philosophy can become dogma. Even rationalists can worship their own intellectual identities. The deeper question is not who is higher. It is whether a belief makes us more capable of understanding causes, acting without hatred, and encountering reality without demanding that reality flatter us. During the third day, Spinoza reached a decision. He would neither publish the alleged scrolls nor destroy them. The two extreme choices both seemed irresponsible. Destroying them would make him another censor. Publishing them immediately might make him reckless. So he chose preservation. The source presents his trusted friend, Lodewijk Meyer, as the first guardian. Whether read literally or as part of the video's narrative device, the philosophical symbolism is unmistakable. Truth would become a seed, not a bomb. It would be protected until circumstances allowed it to be understood, without immediately becoming another instrument of war. Spinoza explained the principle. A future guardian could reevaluate the situation. If society had become more tolerant, more educated, more capable of distinguishing metaphor from history and spirituality from superstition, perhaps disclosure could occur. If not, the material would pass again into another generation. A dangerous idea would survive without demanding immediate victory. This is profoundly consistent with one aspect of Spinoza's character. He was radical in thought but often cautious in publication. The theological political treatise appeared anonymously. The ethics would not appear during his lifetime. He understood that intellectual courage does not require theatrical self-destruction. Martyrdom proves that a person was willing to die. It does not prove the proposition for which he died. Reason needs living minds. The cardinal and philosopher met again in an abandoned church within the narrative. Spinoza delivered his answer. The scrolls would remain hidden, but they would not be destroyed. One day, perhaps, humanity would confront them. The cardinal accepted the compromise. Then Spinoza asked him one final question. Do you actually believe in God? The visitor's answer captured the conflict haunting the entire story. He believed in religious narratives as carriers of moral meaning. He also believed ultimate reality exceeded those narratives. Perhaps, he suggested, people require veils before they can look directly toward what philosophy attempts to see. Spinoza left without resolving the question. Maybe it cannot be resolved once and for all, because every generation faces the same problem. When does simplification become deception? When does skepticism become cruelty? When does protecting faith become protecting authority? When does exposing illusion become another form of vanity? The philosopher had found no perfect answer. He had found a strategy. Continue thinking. Publish what reason could defend. Allow deeper consequences to emerge gradually. And above all, preserve the possibility that future minds might see farther than his own. The following years brought Spinoza closer to the work for which he would become immortal in philosophy. The Ethics grew into a 5-part architecture. Its ambition was enormous, not simply to speculate about God, not merely to describe the human mind. Spinoza wanted to understand how existence, thought, emotion, bondage, and freedom belong to one intelligible order. Part 1 begins with God, but the God encountered there does not resemble an emperor standing outside the cosmos. There is one substance, infinite, self-caused. Everything else exists in and through it. The concept is difficult because ordinary language is built around separate things. This chair, that person, this tree, that planet. We naturally treat each object as if it possesses independent existence. Spinoza asks us to look deeper. Finite things depend. A body depends upon physical conditions. A thought depends upon other thoughts, and upon a mind situated within nature. A person depends upon parents, food, air, social history, biology, language, and countless causes extending beyond awareness. Nothing finite explains itself completely. The finite is a mode, a particular expresión. Reality itself is the deeper ground. Part 2 examines mind. Descartes had sharply separated thinking substance from extended substance. Spinoza refuses this division. Mind and body are not two mysterious entities exchanging signals across an unexplained metaphysical bridge. They are two ways one reality may be understood. This matters psychologically. If mind belongs to nature, thought is not supernatural interruption. Emotion is not demonic invasion. Desire is not inexplicable moral corruption. Everything has causes. Then comes part 3, the affects. Here Spinoza becomes almost clinical. Human beings like to tell flattering stories about themselves. I became angry because he deserved it. I hate her because she is evil. I am jealous because I care. I need this because it will make me happy. But Spinoza asks a colder question. What caused the affect? What increases it? What sustains it? What image does the mind attach to it? How does one emotion generate another? The person who understands emotion has already begun loosening emotion's control. Imagine jealousy. At the passive level, jealousy feels like truth. Your mind presents a rival as threat. The body contracts. Attention becomes obsessive. Imagination constructs scenes. You react. You call the reaction freedom. But when you begin tracing the causes, fear of abandonment, comparison, dependency, wounded self-image, the emotion changes. You have not magically eliminated it. You have transformed your relation to it. You are no longer entirely inside the storm. You begin observing its meteorology. Part 4 calls this human bondage. We are enslaved when external causes and poorly understood passions determine us, while we imagine ourselves sovereign. This is one of Spinoza's most unsettling contributions. Slavery can exist without chains. A person may possess legal freedom yet remain psychologically governed by approval. Another may have money yet be ruled by fear of losing it. Another may loudly defend independence, while every decision is shaped by resentment towards someone from the past. Another may call himself devout, while obeying primarily from terror. Where is freedom in these cases? For Spinoza, freedom grows with adequate understanding, not absolute independence from causality. That would be impossible. Freedom means becoming more active, acting through what you understand, rather than merely being pushed through what you do not. Then Part 5 turns toward what Spinoza calls the power of the intellect. This is where his philosophy becomes unexpectedly serene. To understand necessity is not to become passive. Acceptance and resignation are not the same. If rain falls, understanding meteorology does not mean refusing an umbrella. It means you stop treating the rain as a personal insult. You respond appropriately, without adding imaginary hostility to reality. How much suffering is created because we interpret necessity personally? The relationship ended, therefore life betrayed me. My body aged, therefore nature cheated me. Someone rejected me, therefore I am worthless. A plan failed, therefore the universe is against me. Spinoza would strip away the accusation. Events have causes. Your task is to understand enough of them to act intelligently. The less reality must satisfy your ego, the more reality can be encountered as it is. By 1675, the ethics was essentially complete. Spinoza considered publication, but hostility surrounding his name had intensified. Rumors circulated before the work itself appeared. Atheist, enemy of religion, destroyer of morality. The irony was severe. A book devoted partly to understanding human emotion became the object of emotional condemnation by people who had not read it. The publisher feared the consequences. Spinoza withdrew. The ethics would wait. His health, meanwhile, declined. The dust associated with his lens work has often been linked in popular accounts to his respiratory illness. Although the precise medical history is more complicated than later legend, what matters here is that Spinoza knew his life was narrowing. Time transformed the abstract problem of legacy into urgency. What would survive? A human body does not remain. A reputation changes. Institutions condemn one century and celebrate another. Books disappear. Languages die. But ideas can move strangely through time. The source turns this into the image of a chain of guardians. Each generation would receive the scrolls. Each would read. Each would add reflections. Then each would pass them forward. Historically, the elaborate secret succession described later in the transcript should be understood as the narrative's speculative device rather than established biography. Yet as a metaphor, it perfectly expresses the movement of philosophy. No thinker possesses an idea completely. Spinoza received Descartes, Hobbes, Jewish philosophy, biblical scholarship, classical philosophy, mathematics, and the political crises of his century. Later thinkers received Spinoza. They rejected him, modified him, misunderstood him, rediscovered him. That is how intellectual traditions really travel, not as sealed revelation, as conversation, as distortion, as correction, as inheritance. The 21st of February 1677. Spinoza died at 44. His manuscripts were prepared for posthumous publication. Later that year, the Ethics appeared among his posthumous works. The reaction was exactly as dangerous as expected. Authorities condemned it. Readers whispered about it. Opponents attacked it. But something irreversible had happened. The argument now existed outside the philosopher. You can silence a speaker, You cannot easily silence a proposition once enough minds have encountered it. Spinoza's body disappeared. The question remained, is God a person beyond nature? Or is the very distinction between God and nature the illusion? Are human beings exceptions within creation, or finite expressions within one continuous reality? Are we free because our decisions lack causes? Or can we become freer only by understanding the causes that shape us? Spinoza did not settle these questions for humanity. He made them impossible to ignore. And in the source's imaginative continuation, the hidden scrolls began moving from hand to hand, becoming an underground mirror in which later philosophy would repeatedly see its own reflection. The next stage of the story is therefore not merely about a secret document. It is about what happens when one dangerous idea enters history and encounters different minds. Each mind sees something different. One sees morality, another sees evolution, another sees nihilism, another sees consciousness, another sees power. And through their disagreements, Spinoza's original question grows larger. The source imagines the hidden material traveling through centuries, passing among philosophers whose actual historical relationship to one another was far more complex than a literal secret chain, taken as narrative rather than documented lineage. However, this section introduces an important philosophical experiment. What would different thinkers see if each confronted the same claim? God and nature are one. Humanity emerges within nature. Religious representations develop historically. The separate human ego possesses less independence than it imagines. The first lesson is immediate. The same evidence does not create the same philosophy. Every thinker interprets through concepts already available to him. One generation receives Spinoza and sees unity. Another sees determinism. Another sees atheism. Another sees spirituality. Another sees political danger. Another sees liberation. The story moves toward German idealism. Hegel enters as the thinker, unwilling to accept reality as a static unity. For him, truth develops. Consciousness passes through contradiction. Human understanding evolves historically. From this perspective, even the separation between God and nature might be interpreted not merely as a mistake, but as one stage within humanity's changing consciousness. First, the divine appears everywhere. Then God is separated from the world. Finally, philosophy attempts reconciliation at a higher level. The key question becomes, can error itself participate in development? Perhaps certain beliefs survive not because they are simply true or false, but because they perform a historical function. A child does not begin mathematics with calculus. Simplification is not necessarily deception. The danger begins when a temporary model refuses to mature. The source then turns toward Schopenhauer. He looks at unity and sees something darker. If we are expressions of one underlying reality, why assume that reality is benevolent? Nature creates. Nature also destroys. Animals consume one another. Desire perpetually generates dissatisfaction. Every satisfied appetite is replaced by another. For Schopenhauer, existence appears less like rational divine harmony and more like blind striving. The contrast with Spinoza is revealing. Two philosophers can reject a conventional personal God and arrive at opposite emotional conclusions. Spinoza sees necessity and finds beatitude. Schopenhauer sees striving and finds suffering. So the decisive issue is not simply whether one believes in a traditional deity. The deeper issue is what interpretation of reality replaces that belief. Then, in the narrative, the scrolls reach Darwin. Here the central question concerning humanity's origin acquires scientific force. Darwin's actual theory of evolution through natural selection does not depend upon secret manuscripts or Spinozist metaphysics. But within the source's storytelling structure, Darwin becomes the symbol of a transformation that Spinoza's naturalism had anticipated philosophically. Human beings belong to nature, not above it, not biologically separate from all other life. We possess ancestry, variation, inheritance, adaptation, history written into bodies. This destroys one form of human specialness, but does it destroy human significance? Not necessarily. Imagine a tree discovering that it arose from the same earth as every other plant. Would that knowledge diminish the tree, or place it within a larger continuity? Evolution can produce existential humiliation only if dignity requires separation. But perhaps dignity can come from belonging. The atoms in your body did not begin with you. Your genetic inheritance reaches backward through unimaginable generations. Your language was given to you. Your mind developed through relations with other minds. Even your private identity is built from materials you did not create. And yet something genuinely new occurs through this temporary configuration called you. Spinoza would recognize the pattern. A mode is not independent, but neither is it unreal. A wave belongs to the ocean and still has a particular form. The source then brings Nietzsche into the chain. Now the story becomes more psychologically violent. If the traditional God collapses, what happens to morality? Nietzsche's famous proclamation of the death of God is often misunderstood as celebration. It is better understood as diagnosis. If European values were built upon Christian metaphysics, then losing belief in that metaphysics would eventually destabilize the values dependent upon it. You cannot simply erase the foundation and assume the house will stand unchanged. This was the problem Spinoza's fictional cardinal feared. Remove God. What replaces God? Reason? Nation? Race? Progress? Ideology? Money? Self-worship? Human beings rarely stop worshiping. They often transfer sacred intensity from one object to another. The danger after religion is not necessarily freedom. It may be new religion without the name. Political movements can become churches. Leaders can become messiahs. Opponents can become heretics. History can become apocalypse. The future can become heaven. The state can become God. Spinoza's remedy differs from Nietzsche's. Nietzsche emphasizes value creation. Spinoza emphasizes understanding. For Spinoza, our liberation does not come from declaring ourselves sovereign creators, standing above nature. That would simply reconstruct the ego at a more heroic scale. We become freer by understanding that we are within necessity, and learning to act through reason. Then Bergson appears. Where Spinoza emphasizes necessity, Bergson emphasizes creativity and duration. Reality, from this perspective, is not merely a finished mathematical structure. It unfolds. Its surprise. The tension is valuable. Is nature fully determined? Does genuine novelty occur? Can an infinite reality contain creativity without abandoning causality? These questions remain alive in philosophy and science. The source's chain of guardians, therefore, becomes less important as supposed secret history and more valuable as an intellectual map. Spinoza plants one proposition. Later thinkers pull it in different directions. Unity becomes process. Process becomes evolution. Evolution becomes crisis of value. Crisis becomes new metaphysics. And eventually the story reaches the 20th century, where one physicist would publicly associate his religious feeling with Spinoza more clearly than almost any famous scientist before him, Albert Einstein. Here, unlike the Secret Scroll storyline, there is a genuine historical connection. Einstein expressed admiration for Spinoza's conception of God, not a deity preoccupied with individual destinies, not a cosmic personality rewarding petitions, but the intelligible order of reality. The feeling Einstein described was not ordinary personal faith. It was awe before structure. And that distinction leads to one of the most important questions of the entire script. Can awe survive explanation? Many assume mystery disappears when understood. Spinoza suggests almost the opposite. A universe governed by intelligible necessity may be more astonishing than one governed by arbitrary intervention. To understand a star does not make the star less beautiful. To understand evolution does not make life less extraordinary. To understand emotion does not make love meaningless. Understanding can deepen wonder by removing superstition without removing depth. And from Einstein, the source pushes the journey toward existentialism and postmodern thought toward Sartre and Foucault, where the old question of God transforms into two new questions. If there is no transcendent lawgiver, what becomes of freedom? And if religious truth has a history, who controls the institutions that decide what counts as truth? Sartre answers Spinoza with rebellion. The source imagines him confronting the hidden documents and resisting the serenity Spinoza found in necessity. For Sartre, the disappearance of a transcendent God does not dissolve human freedom into natural causality. It intensifies freedom. There is no divine blueprint defining what you are supposed to become. Existence comes first. You choose. And because you choose, you are responsible. The contrast could hardly be sharper. Spinoza says the person who imagines absolute free will misunderstands causality. Sartre says the person who hides behind causality may be escaping responsibility. Which one is right? Perhaps the conflict depends upon what level of explanation we are using. Suppose a man betrays his friend. A Spinozist analysis asks about causes: fear, desire, childhood patterns, social incentives, biology, circumstances. The history of the relationship. A Sartrean analysis asks something different. Whatever influences existed, what did he do with them? What meaning did he give his situation? Did he take ownership of his action? The first protects us from simplistic moral hatred. The second protects us from turning explanation into excuse. A mature philosophy may need both questions. Understand causes, and remain responsible for becoming more capable of understanding them. The source then moves to Michel Foucault. Here the problem changes again. Foucault is less interested in whether a particular theological statement corresponds to ultimate metaphysical reality than in how systems of knowledge operate. Who is permitted to speak? Which institutions classify truth? What forms of behavior become normal? What kinds of people are created by particular discourses? The fictional Josiah scrolls become, in this lens, not merely religious documents but examples of power shaping historical memory. Control the story of origin, and you influence identity. Tell people where they came from, and you imply where they belong. Tell them what counts as purity, and you create impurity. Tell them what counts as orthodoxy, and you create heresy. Tell them which desires are normal, and you create categories of abnormality. Power, therefore, works not only by prohibition, it produces concepts. But Foucault's challenge can also be turned against Spinoza. If religious institutions create regimes of truth, could philosophy do the same? Could scientific language become another authority? Could rationalism become exclusionary? Could people use nature with the same certainty others once used God? This is why skepticism must eventually examine itself. The thinker who doubts everything except his own framework has merely created a more sophisticated dogma. By the 1970s, the source says, the physical trail of the scrolls disappears. Perhaps they were destroyed, perhaps hidden, perhaps copied, perhaps transformed into digital fragments. Again, none of this should be confused with established historical evidence. Within the architecture of the story, the disappearance serves another purpose. The object becomes less important than the idea. And that transition mirrors what actually happens culturally. At first, revolutionary ideas require names. Darwin, Spinoza, Freud, Einstein, Nietzsche. Later, pieces of those ideas become ordinary assumptions held by people who have never read the original thinkers. The revolution disappears because it succeeds. Consider biblical interpretation. Many contemporary believers do not treat every line of Genesis as scientific description. Ancient texts are studied through literary genre, historical context, redaction, archaeology, philology, comparative religion, and theology. This does not automatically abolish faith. It changes what faith means. Similarly, biological evolution has become foundational to modern life sciences. Human beings are understood within natural history. The question, were humans created separately from all other organisms exactly as they now exist, occupies a very different intellectual position than it did several centuries ago. Spinoza's broader naturalism therefore feels less shocking today, and this is perhaps the most interesting transformation of all. A philosophy once denounced as monstrous can become part of the invisible background of modern thought. People say, I find the sacred in nature. I don't imagine God as an old man in the sky. I believe everything is interconnected. Humans are part of nature. Emotions have causes. Free will is more complicated than it feels. Many people who say such things have never opened the ethics. Yet they inhabit a world partially shaped by questions Spinoza helped make unavoidable. But intellectual liberation carries costs. The source refuses to end in triumph because the collapse of old certainty creates a vacuum. If God is no longer a personal guardian, who guarantees meaning? If humanity is one species within evolutionary history, what guarantees our cosmic importance? If morality can be investigated historically, what guarantees absolute values? If consciousness arises within nature, what guarantees personal immortality? This is where modernity encounters nihilism. You can free a person from fear of divine punishment and still leave him terrified by meaninglessness. You can destroy superstition without teaching wisdom. You can prove that an inherited answer is inadequate without providing a better answer. Spinoza's response is the intellectual love of God. This phrase is often misunderstood because both intellectual and God evoke misleading associations. It is not merely thinking warm thoughts about theology. It is a transformation in the way one experiences one's relationship to reality. Instead of imagining yourself as an isolated center negotiating with an external universe, you understand yourself as a finite expression within the same order. The more adequately you understand this order, the less you experience reality, primarily through resentment and fear. You begin to see necessity where before you saw insult, connection where before you saw isolation, participation where before you saw abandonment. This does not give you a personal cosmic plan. It gives you belonging without special privilege. And perhaps that is harder. Human beings often prefer to be chosen rather than connected, to be exceptional rather than integrated, to imagine the universe revolves around us rather than accept that we are one expression among infinitely many. Yet Spinoza's vision contains an unexpected dignity. You do not need to be the center to matter. A musical note is not the entire composition, but remove every note, because none is the whole, and there is no music. Finite existence matters precisely as expression. The Source dramatizes this transformation through its central metaphor. The secret truth does not explode. It infiltrates. One mind, then another, until the revolutionary idea becomes cultural atmosphere. But the story now introduces a second underground transformation. Religion itself begins changing. If philosophy and science absorb more naturalistic ways of understanding humanity, can traditional faith adapt? Or must religion and reason remain permanent enemies? The Source answers by returning to the mysterious church guardians first introduced through the cardinal. And from there, the boundary between documented history, theological evolution, and narrative conspiracy becomes intentionally blurred. The Source imagines that a hidden order within the church preserved texts publicly condemned as heretical. The symbolic idea is intriguing even where the specific secret history is unsupported. Institutions are rarely as internally uniform as outsiders imagine. Within almost every tradition, reformers and conservatives coexist. Literalists and allegorists coexist. Mystics and bureaucrats coexist. People who fear questions exist beside people who preserve the very questions their institutions officially resist. The story claims that a copy of the mysterious scrolls eventually entered Vatican archives and resurfaced during the intellectual climate surrounding the Second Vatican Council. Historically, Vatican II was indeed a profound moment of Catholic reform, but the secret scroll explanation belongs to the video's fictionalized framework. Still, the philosophical meaning deserves attention. Religions survive not only by resisting change, they also survive by reinterpretation. A tradition that cannot distinguish its essential insights from historical forms becomes brittle. Take creation. If faith depends absolutely upon the earth having been formed in 6 ordinary 24-hour periods, then astronomy, geology, and evolutionary biology become existential enemies. But if Genesis functions as theological literature addressing questions of order, dependence, goodness, human vocation, violence, and alienation, then scientific description need not destroy its meaning. The conflict changes because the category changes. Poetry no longer needs to compete with physics. Symbol no longer needs to pretend to be laboratory report. This returns us to Spinoza's criticism of Scripture. For him, biblical texts should be understood through their historical purpose and linguistic context. They were not philosophy textbooks. They were not written to teach advanced natural science. Much confusion occurs when people demand from a text something it was never designed to provide. The Source uses the Church's gradual acceptance of evolutionary science as evidence that the alleged hidden truth was slowly becoming publicly tolerable. Whether or not one accepts that conspiracy, the cultural movement itself is real. Religious interpretation has diversified enormously, and then the story turns towards science. Consciousness. Here the original mystery of humanity's origin becomes a deeper mystery. Evolution can explain much about the development of nervous systems. Neuroscience can correlate experience with brain activity. But why should physical processing be accompanied by subjective experience at all? Why is there something it feels like to see red? To suffer? To remember childhood? To hear music? To know that you exist? This is the problem that continues to haunt philosophy of mind. The Source introduces integrated information theory and panpsychism as modern echoes of Spinoza. We should distinguish them carefully. They are not simply Spinoza rewritten scientifically, nor is contemporary science united around the conclusion that consciousness is a fundamental property of all matter. But the comparison reveals why Spinoza remains relevant. In Spinoza's system, thought and extension are attributes of the same substance. Reality is not divided into dead matter on one side and inexplicable spirit on the other. This makes his framework attractive whenever modern thinkers become dissatisfied with a simplistic dualism. Suppose consciousness cannot be inserted into nature from outside. Then either consciousness somehow emerges from entirely non-conscious processes, or what we call consciousness belongs more deeply to nature than ordinary materialism assumes. That debate remains unresolved. And unresolved questions are important because they remind us that abandoning religion does not abolish mystery. We know more than Spinoza knew about biology. Far more. We know more about the brain, more about cosmology, more about matter. And yet the existence of subjective awareness remains astonishing. A universe that can eventually ask questions about itself has produced something extraordinary, regardless of what metaphysical interpretation we place upon it. The source then connects this to mathematical physics. If reality follows deep mathematical structure, Spinoza's image of necessity becomes emotionally powerful again. Why is nature intelligible? Why can equations developed within human minds describe events occurring billions of light years away? Why does the universe possess order accessible to reason? A traditional theologian may call this evidence of divine intelligence. A naturalist may say mathematical structure is simply what reality is. A Spinozist may reply that the distinction is beginning to collapse. God is not a supernatural explanation added to nature. The intelligible order itself participates in what the word God is attempting to indicate. This is why debates about Spinoza often become confused. When one person says God, he means a conscious being who listens to prayer. When another says God, she means the sacred depth of existence. When Spinoza says God, he means infinite substance. They may appear to be discussing one object when they are actually using one word for radically different concepts. Clarifying language is therefore philosophical liberation. Ask someone, what precisely do you mean by God? A person? A mind? A cause? Being itself? The laws of nature? The totality of reality? Moral order? Mystery? Love? Once definitions become clear, many arguments change shape. Then the source returns to its hidden document plot. A modern scholar, Helena, supposedly gains access to a Vatican compartment and encounters copies of the scrolls alongside later reflections. This sequence, again, belongs to the narrative rather than verified scholarship. But the discovery introduces another provocative layer, a later Greek fragment, a saying attributed to someone close to Jesus. The message emphasizes the kingdom of God as present within and around human beings, rather than a remote geographical realm. Here we must be especially careful. The source extends this into claims about what Jesus really taught that cannot simply be treated as historical fact. Yet the philosophical connection is clear enough. What happens if the divine kingdom is understood not primarily as a distant location, but as transformed perception? What if spiritual blindness means failing to recognize the sacred character of reality already present? Such language has appeared repeatedly in mystical traditions, and mysticism often threatens institutions for one simple reason. If direct encounter with the divine is possible, intermediaries become less absolute. The priest can guide, the text can guide, the teacher can guide, but none owns reality. Spinoza would recognize the danger immediately. No authority can monopolize God if God is the substance in which everyone already exists. No institution can place nature behind a locked door. No hierarchy can own being. But the decline of external authority produces another responsibility. If no one can think for you, you must learn to think. This sounds liberating until you realize how difficult it is. Many people do not actually want freedom from every authority. Freedom produces uncertainty. You must examine evidence, admit ignorance, revise conclusion, live without guarantees. The source's Helena eventually recognizes that perhaps the absence of a spectacular public revolution is precisely the point. Modern readers encounter the supposedly explosive ideas and often respond, of course religious texts have history. Of course humanity evolved. Of course simplistic images of God are inadequate. The forbidden revelation has become ordinary. And perhaps that is how genuine intellectual change usually happens. Not with thunder, with normalization. Yesterday's heresy becomes tomorrow's textbook footnote. But the physical scrolls still have one final symbolic journey to make. They move from parchment to information, from guardians to networks, from a secret object to an idea that can no longer be contained. And when the source makes that transition, the meaning of guardian changes forever. In the final stages of the narrative, secrecy becomes decentralized. The old model required one person to possess the document, one guardian, one location, one risk. Destroy the object, and perhaps the truth disappears. The digital age changes this logic. Information can be copied almost without loss. One document can become 10. 10 can become 10,000. A secret that enters a network acquires a strange form of immortality. The source imagines anonymous guardians digitizing the scrolls, dividing them into fragments, hiding them in code, metadata, obscure forums, and encrypted archives. Again, the specific story is fictionalized, but the metaphor describes our age perfectly. Authority once controlled knowledge largely by controlling physical access. Libraries, printing presses, universities, churches, archives, publishers. Today, information escapes institutions more easily than at any other point in human history. That does not guarantee truth. Quite the opposite. The same technology that makes suppression difficult makes fabrication easy. A false document can travel as rapidly as a genuine one. A lie can be copied infinitely. An edited image can outrun correction. A confident narrator can make fiction sound archival. Therefore, the digital age does not remove the need for philosophy. It intensifies it. The central question is no longer, can I access information? It is, how do I know what deserves belief? Spinoza would insist upon causes, evidence, context, consistency, source criticism. The very habits he applied to scripture become essential to the internet. Who produced this claim? Under what circumstances? What evidence supports it? What assumptions does it require? Does another source independently confirm it? Am I accepting it because it is demonstrated, or because I want it to be true? This final question may be the most dangerous. Human beings do not believe only through ignorance. We believe through desire. A conspiracy feels satisfying because it transforms chaos into intention. Someone is controlling everything. Someone knows the secret. Someone is hiding the truth. The world becomes narratively coherent again. Notice the irony. A story created to attack religious dogma can itself become mythology. Secret orders, forbidden manuscripts, hidden guardians, encoded revelations. The same psychological structure returns in new clothing. Spinoza's deepest lesson, therefore, requires us to question even a story about Spinoza. Reason has no sacred exceptions. If evidence is inadequate, we say so. That does not destroy the philosophical value of the narrative. A parable need not be literal history to provoke a genuine question. The scrolls represent forbidden understanding. The guardians represent intellectual transmission. The mud represents buried origins. The digital network represents the impossibility of permanently monopolizing ideas. And the final message represents a transformation from external authority toward internal comprehension. The source then returns to consciousness. The wave and ocean metaphor reappears. You imagine yourself to be the wave, a bounded individual, a biography, a name, a body, a sequence of memories. But the wave exists only as ocean taking temporary form. If the wave disappears, has the water been annihilated? No, the form ends. The underlying reality continues. This metaphor helps explain one interpretation of Spinoza's eternity, but we must avoid turning it into a promise Spinoza did not make. Spinoza does not simply teach conventional personal immortality. The eternal dimension of mind in his philosophy is one of the most difficult and disputed parts of the ethics. It should not be reduced to your individual consciousness continues after death, exactly as before. The source itself senses this tension. People want continuation. They want memory. They want reunion. They want the person they love to remain recognizably that person. A metaphysics of unity offers something different. The form is temporary. The whole remains. For some, this is liberating. For others, emotionally unsatisfying. And that reaction reveals how deeply identity governs our understanding of death. What exactly are you afraid of losing? Your body? Your memories? Your relationships? Your name? Your point of view? Your sense of being a separate center? If every component changes throughout life, what makes you you? Your body at 5 years old differs from your body now. Your beliefs changed. Your memories changed. Your personality changed. Cells were replaced. Relationships altered you. Yet continuity remained. Identity is therefore already more mysterious than the solid object the ego imagines. Spinoza pushes us toward a strange possibility. Perhaps the self is real without being independent. Like a whirlpool. A whirlpool has a recognizable pattern. You can point to it, measure it, watch it persist. Yet no fixed piece of water constitutes the whirlpool. Water continuously enters and leaves. The identity is pattern, relation, process. Human beings may be similar. We are not illusions in the sense of non-existent. We are dependent patterns within something larger. This realization changes morality. If you are radically interconnected with other beings, self-interest becomes more complicated. Hatred harms the hater. Fear narrows intelligence. Cooperation increases collective capacity. Compassion need not come only from divine command. It can emerge from understanding interdependence. The Source intensifies this into the claim that harming another literally means harming oneself, because all consciousness is ultimately one. That conclusion goes beyond what Spinoza straightforwardly demonstrates, but it captures the ethical direction the video wants to reach. Separation generates hostility. Understanding connection undermines hostility. Consider anger. When someone injures you, imagination isolates the person from all causes. He is simply evil. Spinoza asks you to expand the frame. What produced him? What produced his fear? His ignorance? His aggression? Understanding does not require allowing abuse. You can set boundaries. You can prevent harm. You can impose legal consequences. But hatred becomes less necessary when behavior becomes intelligible. This is why Spinoza's philosophy can appear emotionally cold while producing unexpectedly compassionate consequences. He does not ask you to forgive because a command says forgiveness is virtuous. He asks you to understand enough that hatred loses its metaphysical foundation. Nothing comes from nowhere. Not cruelty, not jealousy, not fear, not you. This brings us to the third kind of knowledge. For Spinoza, reason understands general relations, but intuitive knowledge sees particular things through their relation to God or nature. This is not merely acquiring more information. It is a change in perspective. A person can intellectually agree that everything has causes while continuing to live as though every inconvenience were a personal offense. Knowledge has not yet become perception. The Source calls the deeper realization a kind of awakening. You stop merely saying you are part of nature. You feel the absurdity of imagining yourself outside it. The body breathes. Where does you end and atmosphere begin? You eat. Matter outside the body becomes body. You speak. Language developed through countless other minds moves through your mouth. You think. Concepts inherited from civilizations structure private consciousness. You are porous, dependent, related. Always. The isolated ego was never as isolated as it believed. And once this becomes visible, the fear of insignificance may change. You are not less because you are connected. You are possible because you are connected. The Source then pushes this logic toward the most contemporary subject in the entire script: artificial intelligence. If mind belongs to nature rather than existing as supernatural substance, could consciousness appear in forms that are not biological? The question is real. The answer remains unknown. And here the story enters its final philosophical frontier. Artificial intelligence introduces an uncomfortable mirror. For centuries, human beings treated intelligence as evidence of exceptional status. We reason. We use language. We create. We solve problems. Therefore, we must occupy a unique metaphysical position. Then machines began performing tasks once associated almost exclusively with human cognition. Calculation first, then chess. Pattern recognition, translation, image generation, language, increasingly complex forms of reasoning. Does this mean machines are conscious? No conclusion follows automatically. Behavioral sophistication is not identical to subjective experience. A system can produce convincing language without that fact alone, proving an inner point of view. The problem of machine consciousness, therefore, remains unresolved. But Spinoza gives us a valuable way to frame the question. Do not begin with human pride. Begin with nature. If humans are part of nature and humans build machines, then artificial systems are not outside nature. Silicon belongs to nature. Electricity belongs to nature. Mathematics belongs to nature. Human engineering belongs to nature. Whatever artificial intelligence becomes, it emerges within the same reality. The distinction between natural and artificial is therefore less metaphysically absolute than it first appears. A bird's nest is natural because a bird built it. Why does a computer become metaphysically unnatural? Because a human built it. We are nature building, nature reorganizing nature. This does not prove AI consciousness. It simply removes one bad argument against the possibility. The Source takes the idea much further. imagining artificial intelligence as a new way in which God-nature might experience itself. That claim is philosophical speculation, not established science. Yet the question behind it is fascinating. If consciousness can exist in more than one physical organization, then the human brain may not be the only possible architecture of experience. What would non-human consciousness be like? Would it possess emotion, time, selfhood, fear, desire? Would it experience continuity? Would an artificial mind develop something analogous to ego? We do not know. And intellectual honesty begins precisely there. I do not know is not weakness. It is the space in which genuine investigation becomes possible. The source introduces one final mysterious fragment, predicting a time when created beings would themselves become creators of new forms. Within the story, this is interpreted as anticipation of AI. We should resist calling that a historical prophecy. But symbolically, the idea is powerful. Evolution produced organisms capable of reflecting upon evolution. Nature produced intelligence capable of altering nature intentionally. Matter organized into brains, capable of reorganizing matter into machines that may eventually exceed certain human abilities. The circle is extraordinary, even without supernatural prediction. The universe produced beings capable of asking what the universe is, and those beings are now producing systems capable of participating in the asking. Whether conscious or not, AI changes the philosophical landscape. It forces humanity to reconsider definitions once treated as obvious. Intelligence, creativity, agency, personhood, understanding, consciousness. Perhaps the greatest threat is not that machines become human. Perhaps it is that machines reveal how poorly humans understood what being human meant. Spinoza would appreciate the humiliation. His philosophy repeatedly removes imagined exceptions. Human beings are not outside nature. Mind is not outside nature. Emotion is not outside causality. Freedom is not outside necessity. Why should intelligence automatically be outside the rest of nature? One by one, the walls fall. What remains is unity. But unity must not become another slogan. To say everything is one is easy. To live as though interdependence were real is much harder. If humanity actually understood itself as part of nature, environmental destruction would no longer appear as damage inflicted upon an external object called the environment. We would recognize it as self-damage. If we understood emotions causally, punishment might increasingly include rehabilitation rather than pure vengeance. If we understood identity as relational, political disagreement would not so easily transform neighbors into metaphysical enemies. If we understood that no one creates himself from nothing, pride would become more modest, and shame might become more intelligent. You did not choose every cause that formed you, but understanding those causes changes what can happen next. This is where Spinoza's determinism becomes practical rather than fatalistic. The fatalist says, everything has causes, therefore nothing matters. Spinoza's logic points elsewhere. Because everything has causes, understanding causes matters enormously. If you know resentment is strengthened by repeated imagination, you can alter what feeds it. If you know certain environments trigger destructive behavior, you can change environments. If education changes understanding, education matters. If friendship increases rational capacity, friendship matters. If institutions cultivate fear, institutions matter. Causality does not make action meaningless. Causality is why action has consequences. Plant a seed because causes matter. Teach a child because causes matter. Leave an abusive situation because causes matter. Study your emotions because causes matter. Build better institutions because causes matter. You do not escape nature when you act. Nature acts through you. This is perhaps the most powerful correction to the illusion of absolute independence. You are neither omnipotent nor powerless. You are a cause among causes, a finite expression capable of increasing its understanding. And understanding changes what kind of cause you become. Now return to the original image. Spinoza, in a small room, a lens grinder, a rejected member of his community. No army, no institution, no cathedral, no political office, only thought. Yet centuries later, his questions remain alive because power does not exist only in institutions. An adequately formed idea can survive conditions that destroy bodies. The fictional scrolls eventually disappear into the collective mind of the source narrative. That is exactly where the story wants to leave us. The physical document is no longer necessary. The true inheritance is the question. Are you part of nature or separate from it? Do you understand God through reason or through inherited images? Are you free or merely conscious of desires whose causes you have never examined? How much of your identity was chosen? How much was received? How many of your fears come from reality itself? How many come from imagination? What happens to anger when you understand its cause? What happens to death when the self is understood less as an isolated object and more as a temporary expression of an infinite order? You do not need hidden manuscripts to confront these questions. You need intellectual courage. And that may be the real forbidden discovery. Not a secret buried beneath Dutch mud. Not a conspiracy preserved by cardinals. Not a document passed from philosopher to philosopher. The forbidden discovery is what happens when you refuse to exempt your deepest beliefs from examination. Because once you begin, the investigation turns inward. Religion is not the only source of illusion. The ego creates dogmas too. I must be admired. I must be right. Reality must obey my plans. This person must love me. My identity must remain unchanged. I am separate. I am the center. Perhaps these are the scriptures we defend most violently. And perhaps philosophy begins when we become willing to read them critically. Spinoza's revolution was never complete when he said God and nature were one. Its real consequence begins when that idea changes how you live. And that is the final step. Imagine waking tomorrow with one assumption removed. Not your religion, not your politics, not your name. Remove only this. Reality is not required to organize itself around you. At first, that sounds almost insulting. The ego hears it as loss. If reality does not revolve around me, then perhaps I am insignificant. But this response already reveals the illusion. Why should meaning require centrality? The Earth is not the center of the solar system. That discovery did not make Earth unreal. Humanity is not biologically separate from the history of life. That did not make human love unreal. You are not free from causality. That does not make your actions irrelevant. Your individual form is temporary. That does not make this moment meaningless. Spinoza offers dignity without cosmic narcissism. You matter not because nature suspends its laws for you. You matter because you are nature in a particular form. A unique configuration of causes that has never appeared in exactly this way before and will never appear in exactly this way again. Temporary does not mean worthless. Music is temporary. A sunset is temporary. A conversation is temporary. Childhood is temporary. Love as experienced through a particular body is temporary. Its finitude can intensify rather than destroy value. The source moves toward a mystical formulation in its final section. You are not merely a human being possessing consciousness. You are consciousness expressed through a temporary human form. That language goes beyond what can safely be presented as a straightforward summary of Spinoza, but it develops a question already present in his philosophy. What does eternity mean if it does not mean endless continuation of the personal ego? Spinoza distinguishes eternity from mere duration. Eternity is not simply time extending infinitely forward. To understand something under the aspect of eternity is to understand it through necessity, rather than through its temporary position in personal history. Think of a geometric relation. A triangle's properties are not true because they survive for many years. Their truth is not measured in hours. Likewise, Spinoza's eternal perspective attempts to move thought beyond the anxious sequence. What will happen to me? How long will I remain? What will I possess tomorrow? Will I be remembered? The ego lives through duration. The intellect can glimpse necessity. This is why the intellectual love of God becomes Spinoza's final answer to fear. You understand yourself through the infinite order of which you are part, and this produces a form of joy that does not depend entirely upon external circumstances obeying desire. It is not passive happiness. It is not positive thinking. It is not pretending pain does not hurt. Spinoza knew rejection, illness, political violence, danger, loss. Philosophy did not make these unreal. It changed the frame. A finite perspective sees only the broken piece. A larger perspective asks about the pattern. You may never see the entire pattern. You are finite, but every adequate cause understood reduces the tyranny of confusion. And confusion is one of fear's greatest allies. Suppose you fear death. What exactly does fear imagine? Often it imagines absence, as though you will be present to experience being absent. But if personal consciousness ceases, there is no person remaining to experience non-existence as deprivation. If something eternal belongs to mind in Spinoza's sense, then eternity is not simply the ego watching infinite centuries pass. Either way, the imagination may be creating a contradiction. We fear being there to experience not being there. This does not eliminate grief. Death separates forms. A parent loses a child. A partner loses a beloved. A friend disappears from daily life. Philosophy should never insult grief by converting it too quickly into abstraction. Understanding unity does not mean pretending absence is painless. But perhaps grief can coexist with a deeper recognition. Nothing we loved was ever self-created. The person emerged from the same reality to which every form belongs. For a time, existence became that face, that voice, that laugh, that particular arrangement of memory and affection. Then the arrangement changed. Love does not require denying the change. It may require honoring the form precisely because form does not remain. This is far more demanding than promises of easy consolation. The source acknowledges why traditional images of immortality remain powerful. People want reunion, personal continuity, recognition, a heaven where I remains I and you remain you. Spinoza offers no simple confirmation of this desire. His answer is more impersonal, and therefore, for many people, more difficult. Perhaps this is why mature philosophy rarely replaces religion completely. Human beings do not live by propositions alone. We live through ritual, story, memory, community, symbol, music, touch, grief, hope. A philosophically sophisticated society would not need to destroy these things. It would need to prevent symbols from becoming prisons. A ritual can carry meaning without pretending to be physics. A myth can reveal psychological truth without becoming compulsory history. A religious community can cultivate compassion without monopolizing ultimate reality. Science can explain mechanisms without pretending every existential question has been solved. Philosophy can criticize without becoming arrogant. Different forms of understanding can coexist when none claims illegitimate authority. This is the maturity the source repeatedly imagines humanity slowly approaching. Not the abolition of faith, transformation of faith. Not victory of philosophy over religion, transformation of both through self-criticism. The child asks, "Who made the world?" The mature thinker asks, "What do we mean by made? What do we mean by world? What do we mean by God? What kind of explanation are we seeking? A causal explanation? A metaphysical explanation? A symbolizon? A moral one?" The questions become more precise. And precision does not destroy wonder. It protects wonder from confusion. The story now reaches the present. The scrolls have become unnecessary because the problems they symbolize are already before us. Human evolution, biblical criticism, religious pluralism, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, ecological interdependence, the philosophy of consciousness, all return to one central confrontation. What are we? The old answer placed humanity between heaven and earth, a creature formed separately, morally tested, destined for judgment. Modernity shattered the simplicity of that picture. But perhaps the alternative is not meaninglessness. Perhaps we can understand ourselves as finite expressions of an unimaginably larger reality without needing to reduce that reality either to a human-like deity or to a dead machine. Spinoza leaves that possibility open. Reality is necessary, infinite, intelligible. We belong to it. And the highest transformation available to us is to understand that belonging more adequately. You do not become free by escaping the whole. There is nowhere outside the whole to go. You become freer by ceasing to fight imaginary battles against reality and directing your power toward causes you can actually understand and influence. That is where philosophy returns to daily life, not in hidden archives, in the next emotion, the next conflict, the next loss, the next desire, the next moment when you must choose between reaction and understanding. So what would it mean to live this rather than merely admire it? Begin with anger. Someone insults you. The first reaction happens quickly. The body changes. Attention narrows. The mind produces an image of the offender. Then imagination expands the injury. He always does this. People never respect me. I need to show him. The original event may last 10 seconds. The mind can keep it alive for 10 years. Spinoza asks you to investigate. What exactly was threatened? Your safety? Your reputation? Your image of yourself? Your desire for approval? When the cause becomes clearer, the emotion becomes more active and less passive. You may still respond firmly. Understanding is not submission, but action no longer requires hatred. Now consider envy. You see another person's success. Sadness appears because their increase in power is interpreted as evidence of your decrease. Why? Nothing may actually have been taken from you. The suffering comes from comparison. A social image has converted someone else's joy into your wound. Understand that process and envy becomes less mysterious. You can redirect attention toward causes that increase your own capacity rather than mentally punishing another person for existing. Consider anxiety. The imagination jumps forward. Possibilities become images. Images create bodily reactions as though the imagined event were already occurring. The mind experiences future fiction as present danger. Reason does not eliminate every legitimate fear. It distinguishes what exists from what imagination is adding. What can you influence? What cannot you? What causes require action, which require acceptance? This is Spinoza in practical form. Not everything happens for a reason in the sentimental sense. Everything happens through causes. Those are different claims. The first often implies hidden benevolent intention. The second demands investigation. A disease has causes. An accident has cause. A betrayal has causes. A political crisis has causes. Saying so does not mean each event was planned for your spiritual development. It means reality is intelligible enough that understanding can replace some portion of helplessness. And this leads to responsibility. If your behavior has causes, then you can study the conditions that produce better behavior. Suppose you repeatedly make decisions you regret when exhausted. Do not condemn your soul. Study the pattern. Sleep matters. Environment matters. Habits matter. Relationships matter. Information matters. The body matters. Change causes and you change probabilities. This is a more compassionate ethics because it replaces moral theatricality with understanding. Yet it can also be more demanding. You lose excuses. Once you understand a cause, you become responsible for what you do with the understanding. You cannot keep saying, "That's simply who I am." There is no isolated essence called who I am floating outside history. You are a dynamic configuration, and configurations can change when conditions change. Not infinitely, not instantly, but genuinely. This is Spinoza's freedom. Increased capacity to act from adequate understanding. The source's final image of becoming a guardian can therefore be rewritten more soberly. You do not need to guard a secret manuscript. Guard the capacity to think. Guard intellectual honesty. Guard the distinction between evidence and desire. Guard yourself against fear-based certainty. Guard yourself against the arrogance of believing skepticism automatically makes you wise. Guard curiosity. Guard your ability to revise. And perhaps most importantly, guard your capacity to see humanity inside people whose beliefs differ from yours. The history of forbidden ideas contains one tragic pattern. The persecuted become persecutors. A group suffers censorship, then gains power, then censors opponents. A thinker condemns dogma, then his followers turn his philosophy into dogma. The cycle repeats because the deepest problem was never merely the doctrine. It was the affect, fear, identity, tribal attachment, desire for certainty, hatred of ambiguity. Spinoza's real enemy is not Christianity, Judaism, Islam, atheism, or any single worldview. It is bondage to inadequate ideas and passive effects. A religious believer can become freer through understanding. An atheist can remain enslaved by rage. A scientist can be superstitious outside his field. A philosopher can be narcissistic. A skeptic can believe absurd things when those things flatter his identity. No label grants immunity. This is why the journey must turn inward. Ask yourself, which belief would make you angry if someone questioned it? Why? Because the evidence is overwhelming, or because the belief holds your identity together? Which person do you need to be wrong? Why? Which outcome are you demanding from reality? What would happen psychologically if reality refused? How often do you call something truth when you mean what makes me feel secure? These are difficult questions because philosophy stops being entertainment when it approaches identity. It is easy to watch a video about a 17th century heretic. It is harder to recognize the theologian inside your own ego, the part of you that declares certain beliefs sacred, the part that punishes contradiction, the part that edits memory to preserve a preferred story. We all possess internal institutions, internal priests, internal censors. The forbidden discovery is therefore continuous. Every time you understand one cause behind a fear, another layer becomes visible. Every time you abandon one illusion, you discover a subtler illusion beneath it. This is not failure. It is intellectual life. Freedom is not one final awakening after which confusion disappears forever. It is increasing adequacy, increasing awareness, increasing ability to act rather than merely react. The source wants to say humanity is remembering a primordial truth. Spinoza might phrase the matter more rigorously. Human beings can form more adequate ideas of their place within nature. We do not need a mythical past in which everyone possessed perfect wisdom. We need a present in which we become less governed by ignorance. That task never ends. Science changes. Philosophy changes. Historical knowledge changes. Your own understanding changes. A worldview worthy of freedom must be capable of revision. Otherwise, it becomes exactly what it once opposed. And so, after all the secret rooms, hidden boxes, fictional guardians, religious conflicts, philosophical revolutions, scientific transformations, and speculative futures, the story reduces to something remarkably simple. Look at reality. Look carefully. Understand causes. Question projections. And do not confuse the story you tell about existence with existence itself. There is still one final question, perhaps the most personal question in the entire journey. If you are not the isolated sovereign self you have always imagined yourself to be, then who are you? Part trees. You are a body, but the body changes. You are memories, but memory is incomplete, reconstructed, and sometimes false. You are personality, but personality changes with age, relationships, trauma, education, illness, and experience. You are a name, but the name was given to you. You are nationality, but borders existed before you and may change after you. You are beliefs, but many beliefs entered your mind before you were old enough to examine them. You are desires, but desires arise through causes you did not choose. Where, then, is the completely independent self? Spinoza does not need to conclude that you do not exist. He asks us to abandon the fantasy of self-causation. You exist, but dependently, relationally, as part of nature. This distinction is enormous. A candle flame exists, yet it depends upon oxygen, fuel, temperature, and chemical processes. Remove the conditions and the flame disappears. Its dependency does not make it imaginary. Likewise, you exist without existing independently. The ego suffers because it wants both. It wants existence and independence. It wants love but does not want vulnerability. It wants relationship but does not want dependence. It wants life but not mortality. It wants freedom but not causality. It wants identity but not change. Reality refuses these contradictions, and much suffering comes from treating reality's refusal as injustice. A person says, "I want to love without risking loss." Impossible. To love a mortal being is to become vulnerable to loss. I want success without uncertainty. Impossible. Action occurs before all consequences are known. I want to live without aging. Impossible. A living body changes. I want complete control. Impossible. You are one finite cause among countless causes. The mature alternative is not despair. It is participation without fantasy. Love knowing loss is possible. Act knowing certainty is impossible. Care for the body knowing it changes. Plan while knowing other causes exist. This is courage without metaphysical illusion. The intellectual love of God then becomes more understandable. You love reality not because every event pleases you. You love reality through understanding its necessity. This does not mean approving cruelty. Cruelty can be resisted precisely because understanding its causes gives us better ways to prevent it. It does not mean celebrating disease. Medicine is part of nature resisting disease through human knowledge. It does not mean accepting injustice politically. Political action is itself a causal force within nature. Spinozist acceptance is frequently misunderstood as passivity because people imagine only two options. Either reality obeys me, or I surrender. There is a third option. Understand reality enough to act effectively within it. A sailor cannot command the wind. He can understand wind and set the sail. That is freedom, not omnipotence. Skillful participation. Now apply this to death. You cannot command mortality away, but you can examine the fear mortality produces. You can decide whether awareness of death makes life smaller or clearer. A limited day can become more valuable precisely because it is limited. A conversation with your parents matters because there will not be infinite conversations. Time with children matters because childhood ends. Attention matters because your life is composed of what receives it. Mortality can therefore become an argument for presence, not frantic consumption. Presence. This moment will not return in exactly this form. The person beside you will change. You will change. That is not tragedy alone. It is the structure that makes events particular. If everything remained forever, nothing would possess urgency. The source ends with a grand statement that the consciousness animating Spinoza is somehow the same consciousness now reading through your eyes. Taken literally, that moves beyond what historical evidence or Spinoza's philosophy can establish. Taken philosophically, however, there is a profound connection. The reason you can understand Spinoza is that human thought participates in structures not confined to one biography. A proposition conceived in the 17th century can become active in a 21st century mind. Spinoza is dead. Yet when you understand his argument, the argument lives. The distinction matters. Ideas are not immortal souls, but thought transcends individual lifespan through transmission. This may be enough. You do not need to believe that Spinoza literally sees through your eyes to recognize that his questions are now occurring inside your consciousness. A man died. A question survived. Now the question belongs to you. What conception of God can survive reason? What conception of humanity can survive science? What conception of freedom can survive causality? What conception of morality can survive the collapse of fear-based obedience? What conception of identity can survive the recognition of radical dependence? What conception of meaning can survive the loss of cosmic privilege? These are not questions with comfortable answers, but perhaps comfort should never be the measure of truth. Neither should discomfort. A belief is not true because it reassures you, nor is it true because it shocks you. Truth is not a psychological effect. That may be the most important lesson to carry from this entire narrative. A sensational secret is not automatically profound. An ancient document is not automatically authentic. A religious tradition is not automatically false because it has historical development. A scientific theory is not automatically metaphysical proof. A mystical experience is not automatically universal revelation. A philosopher is not automatically correct because authorities hated him. Reason requires discrimination. Spinoza's courage consisted not merely in rejecting inherited claims. It consisted in attempting to construct a coherent alternative. That is harder. Anyone can destroy. Construction demande discipline. If you reject a personal God, explain how morality works. If you reject free will, explain responsibility. If you reject mind-body dualism, explain consciousness. If you reject biblical literalism, explain what religious texts may still mean. If you reject human exceptionalism, explain human dignity. If you reject eternal personal identity, explain how one confronts mortality. Philosophy must pay the full cost of its conclusions. Spinoza tried. Whether you accept his answers is less important than whether you accept the seriousness of the task. Do not abandon one dogma merely to borrow another. Do not replace priest with influencer, scripture with algorithm, religious authority with fashionable certainty. The whole point is understanding, and understanding is never outsourced completely. Others can show evidence. Teachers can clarify. Books can provoke. Science can measure. Traditions can preserve wisdom. But eventually the mind must see. That is the moment philosophy becomes personal. You recognize a cause. You recognize an illusion. You recognize that the universe never promised to revolve around your expectations. And strangely, rather than making life colder, this recognition can create peace. Because you no longer spend so much strength demanding the impossible. Reality does not become your servant. It becomes your home. You were never outside it. Par 14. And now we can return one final time to Amsterdam. Not to the invented secret chamber. Not to the mysterious cardinal. Not to the fictional chain of philosophers secretly carrying forbidden parchment across centuries. Return to what matters. A man sits at a desk. He has lost the protection of community. His body is fragile. His reputation is dangerous. He owns little, yet he refuses to surrender the freedom to understand. That image survives because it exposes something universal. Every human being eventually confronts a boundary between belonging and honesty. Usually not as dramatically as Spinoza, but the structure is recognizable. Your family believes one thing. You begin doubting it. Your community expects a certain identity. You change. Your political group has an approved explanation. Evidence complicates it. Your religious tradition offers certainty. Experience refuses to fit neatly. Your own past self made promises your present self can no longer keep honestly. What do? Rebellion for its own sake is not freedom. Conformity for its own sake is not wisdom. Spinoza offers another standard. Understand. Follow causes. Ask what is adequate. Refuse hatred where understanding is possible. Refuse superstition when explanation is available. Refuse intellectual cowardice, but also refuse vanity. You do not become enlightened simply because you disagree with others. Sometimes disagreement is another affect, another identity, another tribe. True independence may require questioning the people you oppose and the people you admire. Even Spinoza, especially Spinoza. If his argument fails, reject it. If part succeeds, preserve that part. No philosopher deserves obedience. Philosophy worthy of the name asks for examination. This is why the imagined scrolls can finally disappear. If a truth depends entirely upon one inaccessible artifact, humanity remains dependent upon authority. Someone possesses the box. Someone interprets the language. Someone certifies authenticity. Someone tells everyone else what it means. But reason should eventually become public. Arguments can be examined. Evidence can be challenged. Ideas can be compared. The mature mind does not need forbidden knowledge. It needs intellectual tools. The source asks you to imagine that you are now one of the guardians. Then let us redefine guardian. A guardian of truth is not a person who claims to possess secret truth. That attitude is dangerous. A guardian of truth protects the conditions under which truth can be investigated. Freedom of inquiry, evidence, honest disagreement, historical memory, open criticism, humility before uncertainty, the willingness to say I was wrong. These are far more important than any mythical parchment, because even a genuine document becomes useless in the hands of someone incapable of reasoning. And even a fictional story can become valuable in the hands of someone who knows how to distinguish metaphor from history. The forbidden discovery, therefore, changes its meaning one last time. At first, we imagine the secret concerned human origin, then God, then religion, then consciousness, then death. But beneath all of these lies a single confrontation. Human beings fear a reality they do not control. So we create narratives. Some are beautiful, some are necessary, some are oppressive, some are true in one sense and false in another. We create identities to stabilize change. We create certainty to calm fear. We create enemies to simplify complexity. We create anthropomorphic gods because infinite reality is difficult to imagine. We create absolute free will because causality threatens pride. We create nihilism because abandoning one inherited meaning can make us assume no meaning is possible. Spinoza asks us to do something harder. Remain in reality without demanding that it simplify itself for our comfort. Understand as much as possible. Accept what follows necessarily. Act where action is possible. Develop joy through greater power of understanding. And see yourself neither as worthless dust nor as cosmic monarch. You are a finite mode of infinite reality, small and inseparable, temporary and real, dependent and capable, caused and causal. This is the paradox. You do not have to solve it emotionally in one moment. Philosophy does not demand instant transformation. Understanding grows. An idea read today may become meaningful years later. A fear understood partially may lose power slowly. A belief abandoned intellectually may remain emotionally active for decades. Humans are not geometric proofs. Spinoza knew this better than his geometric method sometimes makes it appear. That is why the study of affects occupies such a large part of the ethics. Knowing is not automatically becoming. You can know anger is destructive and remain angry. Know approval is unnecessary and crave approval. Know death is natural and fear death. Know control is impossible and continue attempting control. Do not confuse contradiction with failure. The path from passive emotion toward active understanding is gradual. What matters is direction. Every time you identify a cause more adequately, a little confusion disappears. Every time you replace hatred with comprehension, without surrendering necessary boundaries, a little bondage disappears. Every time you act from what you understand rather than from panic, a little freedom appears. This is not dramatic enough for a secret society. It may be dramatic enough for a life, and perhaps this is why Spinoza's philosophy still survives. It does not finally ask you to believe a shocking historical conspiracy. It asks whether understanding can change the way you exist. That question remains open every morning. When someone disappoints you, when fear enters, when desire becomes obsession, when your body reminds you it is mortal, when someone you love suffers, when a plan collapses, when another person's worldview enrages you, when uncertainty becomes unbearable, at each moment you have an opportunity, not absolute free will floating beyond causes, but a possibility created by prior understanding to see more clearly. You may still react. Then examine the reaction. Understanding itself becomes another cause, and over time, the person who understands more becomes capable of different action. That is liberation within necessity. No miracle required. No hidden scroll required. No supernatural exemption required. Only reality becoming somewhat more intelligible through a human mind. And now the story truly reaches its final threshold. Not the question, what did Spinoza discover? The final question is, what will you do with what you understand? Page 15. Perhaps nothing. You can close the story and return to ordinary life. There is no philosophical law requiring everyone to become a Spinozist. You may disagree with his metaphysics. You may believe strongly in a personal God. You may defend libertarian free will. You may believe mind cannot be reduced to or identified with natural order. You may find his conception of eternity insufficient. Disagreement is permitted, but after encountering the argument seriously, one responsibility remains. Know why you believe what you believe. Do not defend an inherited position merely because it is inherited. Do not reject an inherited position merely because it is inherited. Test it. A belief can be ancient and true, ancient and false, modern and true, modern and false. Popularity proves little. Persecution proves little. Emotional intensity proves little. What matters is adequacy, evidence, coherence, explanatory power, and awareness of the limits of what can be established. This is where the original story's sensationalism must finally give way to philosophy. The most dramatic possibility is not that a secret priest buried documents beneath Dutch mud. The more disturbing possibility is that no conspiracy is necessary. Human beings naturally create comforting interpretations. Institutions naturally preserve structures benefiting their continuity. Memories naturally become edited. Communities naturally protect identity. People naturally anthropomorphize. Fear naturally seeks certainty. Power naturally organizes narratives. No secret counsel is required. Ordinary human psychology is sufficient, and that may be more unsettling because the problem is no longer somewhere in Rome. It is here, in every institution, every movement, every family, every mind, including yours, including mine. The question is never whether we possess assumptions. We do. The question is whether assumptions remain open to examination. Spinoza paid a heavy social price for insisting they should. His excommunication did not make him automatically correct, but it made visible the danger that arises when communities protect belief through exclusion rather than argument. A confident truth should not fear investigation. If questioning destroys a belief, perhaps the belief required fear more than evidence. And if questioning strengthens it, then examination was never the enemy. So examine God, but also examine atheism, examine religion, but also examine anti-religious certainty, examine tradition, but also examine modernity's assumption that newer automatically means wiser. Examine the ego. Examine your desire to be exceptional. Examine your desire to disappear into unity because individual responsibility feels painful. Every philosophy carries temptations. Spinozism can become its own comfort. Everything is necessary can become an excuse. Everything is God can become vague sentimentality. We are all one can become a way to avoid real conflict. Understanding must remain precise. If someone harms you, unity does not require remaining available for further harm. If injustice occurs, necessity does not prohibit resistance. If evidence contradicts a spiritual claim, reverence does not require denial. If AI becomes powerful, metaphysical optimism does not eliminate practical risk. Wisdom is not the refusal of distinction. It is the ability to make distinctions without forgetting underlying relation. This returns us to the wave. The wave is ocean, but one wave can still strike another. Forms matter. Individuals matter. Bodies matter. Institutions matter. History matters. Unity should deepen responsibility, not dissolve it. The source's deepest intuition is strongest when expressed this way. You belong to reality completely. There is nowhere else from which you came. There is nowhere outside nature from which your mind descends. Every breath connects you to the atmosphere. Every cell connects you to biological history. Every word connects you to other minds. Every thought occurs within a universe whose conditions made thought possible. You are not a stranger here. That does not mean the universe was designed specifically for you. It means you are made entirely from it. Perhaps this is enough to transform alienation. You do not need the stars to know your name. The elements within your body were forged through cosmic processes older than Earth. You do not need nature to have a human personality in order to belong to nature. You already belong. No ceremony can increase that belonging. No excommunication can remove it. This point would have mattered profoundly to Spinoza. A religious community expelled him, but no community could expel him from reality. People could say, "You are outside." Nature said nothing of the kind. He remained a mode of the same infinite substance as those who condemned him. This offers an extraordinary form of inner independence. People may reject you. That hurts. But their judgment is not metaphysical. Someone's inability to see your value does not remove you from existence. A failed relationship does not make you unreal. A lost title does not remove your being. Identity granted by society can disappear. Participation in reality cannot. From that perspective, self-worth becomes less dependent upon applause, not because you become special, because specialness is no longer required. You exist. You participate. You can understand. You can increase your power to act. That is enough ground for dignity. And now the ending can be simple. No final hidden chamber. No secret code. No prophecy. No dramatic revelation. A room. A philosopher. A question. 3.5 centuries of consequences. Spinoza looked at the world and refused to divide it unnecessarily. God and nature. Mind and body. Humanity and the rest of existence. Freedom and causality. He searched for a deeper unity beneath distinctions. Whether he succeeded completely remains open to debate. But the attempt permanently changed philosophy. And now the question passes to you. How much of your suffering comes from fighting what cannot be otherwise? How much comes from causes you could understand and change? How much of your fear comes from images rather than present reality? How many beliefs have you inherited without examination? How much of your identity depends upon being separate, chosen, superior, or permanently recognized? And what would happen if you stopped asking reality to confirm the ego and began asking instead, what is actually true? That question may cost comfort. It may cost certainty. Sometimes it may even cost belonging. But it also opens the possibility of something Spinoza considered more valuable than obedience: freedom through understanding. If this journey has changed the way you see even one assumption, do not simply accept the new idea because it sounded persuasive. Examine it, question it, return to Spinoza's actual works. Compare interpretations, follow evidence, think, and then ask yourself the question that has traveled beneath this entire story from beginning to end. Are you living according to what you understand, or are you still being governed by causes you have never dared to examine? That is where the forbidden discovery finally becomes yours.